Good morning, everyone. My name is Jean Herb, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the New Jersey Climate Change Resource Center's Fall Climate Academy. Today, we're going to be providing a spotlight on the Massachusetts Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program, the MVP program. I'm the Executive Director of the Environmental Analysis and Communications Group at the Rutgers University Blaustein School, and I'm joined by my colleague Marjorie Kaplan, who's the Associate Director of the Rutgers Climate Institute. Together, we co-direct the New Jersey Climate Change Resource Center, which I'll give you an overview towards the end of today's webinar. We're also joined by the incomparable Matt Drews, who will be our tech assistant today and is the person who keeps us running through all these fall climate academies. Today's webinar will last until 1 o'clock. Other than today's presenters and the Rutgers team, you're all muted. So to communicate with us, please type your questions into the chat box. To find the chat box, look at the bottom of the screen and you'll see a little bubble that says chat. And if you click on it, you'll be able to send us questions and comments. Please send your notes to all panelists, so that ensures that everyone working behind the scenes today will be able to see your questions, and we'll do our very best to answer all questions. We welcome your thoughts. We welcome your questions. Today's event is being recorded, and the recording will be available on the website for the New Jersey Climate Change Resource Center, where the recordings for all of the Fall Climate Academy webinars, as well as the Summer Climate Academy webinars, have been posted. And Marjorie just typed the website for the Climate Change Resource Center into the chat box. One continuing education credit is available through the Association for Floodplain Management, and 1.5 certification maintenance credits are available through the American Planning Association. So that's all the business for right now, and I'm really pleased to get this conversation started. We are so happy to have three terrific guests with us today, who together will give us an overview of several intersected climate change adaptation and resilience programs in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. First, Mia Mansfield will be speaking. Mia is the Director of Climate Adaptation and Resilience in the Massachusetts Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. Mia will give us an overview of the Massachusetts' climate adaptation work, including some background and the context for Massachusetts policy, the combined state hazard mitigation and climate adaptation plan, and the Resilient Massachusetts Action Team and the current work of the Action Team. After Mia, we'll hear from Kara Runsten. Kara is the manager of the Massachusetts Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program, which I think for the rest of today's webinar, we'll just refer to it as the MVP program. Kara is within the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs as well, and she will focus on giving us an overview of the MVP program, both including the planning and action grants and some examples of grants that have been given through the program. And then finally, after Kara, we'll hear from Laurie Connors, who is the planner in the town of Millbury, Massachusetts. Laurie will give us an overview of Millbury's regional MVP planning grant and subsequent action grant projects that the town has undertaken with those resources. After all three of our panelists have spoken, we'll open it up for Q&A. And Marjorie will be monitoring the chat box to look at any questions that you may raise, and we'll try to answer as much of them or all of them as we can in the time that we have today. So that is our agenda for today. Again, please remember to use the chat box if you have questions. And so now it's my pleasure to invite Mia Mansfield to turn on her camera and her microphone and to begin sharing her screen. Mia, you're all good?
Thank you. I'm mostly good. I did turn the video on, but I'm not seeing a video. Do you?
I am not seeing a video, so that might be a bandwidth.
Okay. Well, let me just get started and see if something changes.
Yeah. So your screen is showing.
Okay. Great. All right. And that's looking. That looks okay on your end.
That looks great.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you all for having me. I'm sorry my video is not working. I'll see if I can mess with that a bit later. My name is Mia Mansfield. I'm the Director of Climate Adaptation and Resilience at the Massachusetts Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. And I work with Kara and a few other team members on the Commonwealth's adaptation strategy and program that I'll give you a bit of a context, an overview now, and then Kara will dive into our MVP municipal program that she manages. So just as you know, climate is changing. These are some of the projections that we're operating under in Massachusetts. We're experiencing these effects already today and have really motivated our administration to take a really strong stance on how we advance climate adaptation and mitigation planning and implementation. And we just put together this slide because our office and the state sort of as a whole has a really diverse focus on both mitigation, adaptation, and hazard mitigation that are run by different agencies under different mandates, different funding programs. But through our focus on these three topic areas and also where they overlap, we're really able to sort of address a wide range of smart growth, community outreach and development, green infrastructure, local and state policy issues to enhance sustainability and resiliency across the Commonwealth. And these are sort of our two policy mandates that we're operating under: an executive order that was signed in 2016 by Governor Baker to mandate a comprehensive approach to both reducing greenhouse gas emissions and preparing for the impacts of climate change through a state adaptation plan, identified climate change coordinator, secretariat, the vulnerability assessments, and the development of a program to provide municipal support, which is our MVP program. And then 2 years later, in 2018, an environmental bond bill was passed that had a really significant focus on climate resiliency and adaptation, and also codified the executive order and the MVP program. I just wanted to mention that our office also leads the climate mitigation efforts of the state. Though this presentation and our work is entirely focused on adaptation, there is a parallel process going on right now to identify how Massachusetts can achieve at least 90% greenhouse gas reductions by 2050 and an interim goal and strategies by 2030. And this is called the Roadmap to a Decarbonized Massachusetts. Underway now, and the initial 2030 plan is going to be out by the end of the year. So if this is something that you're interested in, please check out that link in red at the bottom. I apologize, my slides look a bit fuzzy. I'm not really sure why that is. But anyway, this is internally at the state. Our adaptation strategy is guided by the State Hazard Mitigation and Climate Adaptation Plan that 2 years ago in 2018. This was a really interesting and unique effort because we partnered with our emergency management agency, MEMA, to merge the FEMA mandated hazard mitigation plan with our new climate adaptation plan and with the use of the state's best available climate change data to develop this integrated hazard mitigation climate adaptation plan. And this is a model that we encourage municipalities to undertake as well, since they already have to do FEMA hazard mitigation plans, to connect that process, those stakeholders, that buy-in that's already there with the state's best available climate data in a forward-looking approach to hazard mitigation. And so that's what we did at the state level, and we implement the plan internally through the Resilient Mass Action Team, which I'll focus on, and then through local partnerships and the MVP program, which Kara will. Resilient Massachusetts Action Team. This is a team that was launched a year ago. It's an interagency steering committee with representatives from every single secretariat and most key agencies across state government to coordinate on the implementation of the plan and to develop cross-agency tools and resources to support everyone in moving forward. In our first sort of full year as a team, I co-lead this group along with my colleague in MEMA, that's the Emergency Management Agency. We are focused on the development of climate resiliency design standards and guidance for state agencies and the development of a climate resiliency risk screening tool, and also starting to track our actions and our progress online. So if you go on resilientma.org, that's our climate change clearinghouse. We have our state plan online there, and also this action tracker, which we update annually to mark the progress of the 100 or so actions in the plan, specific project updates, so that we can sort of have more transparency and accountability of how we're moving forward in these interim years before we do as a more significant update of the plan at the 5-year mark. And then the Climate Resiliency Standards Project is what I wanted to highlight in my presentation. This was a global action, meaning across agency action within our plan, and a priority action to develop shared and consistent resiliency standard for state agencies that are using state capital funds to design and invest in assets across the state. And so we are working to develop consistent resiliency standards for how to use our climate change data in the design of projects with physical assets, guidelines for best practices on meeting these standards, and then pulling it together in a web-based tool to provide a project risk rating and design standard recommendations. What we mean by standards for this project, as I mentioned, is a consistent process that when it's conducted repeatedly by different people with different knowledge levels and different agencies, they will still get a consistent outcome to guide the recommended planning horizons, climate parameters, and design criteria that a project should be building towards. And here are some of a little bit more on what we mean by standards. To what year should a project be looking towards and using our climate data? What climate parameters what climate hazards is it most at risk of based on its location and future projections? Which design criteria should be incorporated into design, and which recurrence intervals or design storms should it be planning for? And what we're working to develop right now, this project, and we've been working for a little over a year within our state agency working groups and some external stakeholder committees, and we're looking towards a launch in the early part of next year, where we would have these recommended standards, and then these very specific design methodologies, meant for designers and engineers for how to go into the climate data and different steps that you need to take to accomplish the recommended design criteria for the project. And here at the top part of the screen, I just wanted to emphasize this tier approach that we're looking at, which is projects that have different levels of criticality for the state and different lifespans would have different recommended methodologies in order to reach different levels of stringency. And ultimately, what we're looking at is the development of a web-based tool that would be on resilientma.org, where a project manager could go in, put some information about a project, its location, answer questions on its criticality and function and use, and then tied to our climate data on resilientma.org, be able to pull up a climate risk rating report and receive those recommended design standards. And so we're going to be piloting that next year through our administration and finance office and through some grant programs like MVP as we see how it works and see how we can continuously improve this tool and resource moving forward. All right, and that's it for me. At this point, I will turn it over to Kara to tell you a bit more about our municipal program.
Thank you so much, Maya. Thanks so much. That was really interesting. And apologies that I mispronounced your first name to start off with. So thanks so much. This is really interesting. I'd like to turn it over to Kara Runsten, who's going to give us an overview of the MVP program. Kara, if you're okay. I can see.
Got it. Okay. Let me just turn on my video, hopefully.
Yep.
See how it goes. All right. And then I'm going to share my screen as well.
Great. Thank you.
No problem. Okay. All right. Just give me one moment. Okay.
You're good. We see that.
Awesome. Okay, I'm just going to put it into full screen mode. Okay, perfect. So yeah, thank you, Jean, for having us, and thanks, Maya, for passing it off to me. I am the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Programs Manager, as Maya had mentioned, and Jean mentioned as well. And I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of basically the design and setup of the program and how far we've come to date. And then after me, Laurie Connors from Millbury is going to talk a little bit more from the municipal perspective about her involvement with the program. So first, I thought it would be good to just start off with our kind of working definition of climate resilience and what we're really trying to address through this program. So we see climate resilience as the ability of a community to address the needs of its built, social, and natural environment to anticipate, cope with, and rebound stronger from events and trends related to climate change hazards. And what that really means to us is, not just recovering from a shock, but having the systems in place to really recover in ways that make you better off than before. And so that's sort of our foundation for what we're working off of. And then, as Maya mentioned, the MVP program is sort of the sister program to the SHMCAP, or the State Hazard Mitigation and Climate Adaptation Plan. And it's really how we're implementing priorities in that plan on the ground locally. And we are responding to lots of the different vulnerabilities and hazards, some of which you can see on the slide. We have about 300 high hazard dams in Massachusetts, 12,000 plus culverts and small bridges that need replacement across the Commonwealth, and not really just replacement, but also building them to a higher standard that will incorporate, the changing climate as well. And then we also have lots of municipally owned coastal structures and other structures that are, definitely in the floodplain and need to be addressed into the future. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the two different programs that we offer through the MVP program. We have what's called our planning grants, and then also what's called our action grants. So planning grants are typically smaller grants, as you can see from the slide, than the action grants, but they're sort of the entrance into the MVP program. We spend about $1 million per year through this particular program. And basically, municipalities work with a state-trained consultant or provider to go through a prescribed process called the Community Resilience Building process with the town. And that's a process that was developed by the Nature Conservancy, who is a great partner to the program and has a lot of great resources on that, which I'll have a link to that a little bit later in this presentation. And then after they go through the planning process, which again, I'll go into a little bit more detail in a second, but the actions that come out of that planning process are then able to be applied for action grant funding. So action grant funding is a larger pot of money. We have about $10 million per year available through that, through the bond bill that Maya had mentioned earlier. We fund projects up to $2 million for 1 or 2 years. And so that's how people are able to move into sort of the implementation stage after the planning process. So this slide shows a little bit about where we've been to date with the MVP program. We're entering our 5th year, I believe. We started in 2017 under the leadership of our now current secretary, Katie Theoharides. And we have grown a lot as a program, especially over the past year or so. I came on board a bit over a year ago now, and since then we have also hired 6 regional coordinators throughout the state who are really sort of the one-on-one people working with the municipalities on the grant program and on their climate resilience projects in general. So they're really great resources. And I rely very heavily on them. And as you can see, the shaded communities in the map here are those that are currently or have already participated in the MVP planning process. So we're really proud to have 89% participation as of about a month ago when we announced our new planning grant grantees. So that's about 312 communities, and we're actively seeking to get the rest of the communities also in the program. And then in terms of action grants, you can see here that we've, if you add all those up, I believe it's over 160 projects to date in the action grant program. And those are all of the dots that are on the map here. You can see the legend in the corner. And that means with all of those combined, we have awarded about $44 million to date through the program. So a significant investment in these projects throughout the state. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more about the planning grant process, as I mentioned before I get into this a little bit deeper. So this information on this slide is sort of displaying what I talked about previously in a little bit of a different way, but these are basically the steps of the community resilience building process that the grantees go through, or the municipalities go through the planning grant process. So basically, the municipality would select a state-trained provider. We train all of the providers in the CRB process and on our latest climate change data that's available on our resilientma.org website that I think Mia talked about a little bit earlier. And so the municipality would then convene a core team of municipal officials, volunteers, other community leaders that would really take the whole municipality through the process from start to finish. They hold 1 to 2 workshops where the community goes through the CRB process. And it's really important at those workshops to have a diverse set of stakeholders at the workshops that really represent everybody in town, including those that are usually underrepresented in municipal processes. So those stakeholders work together to identify the hazards that they expect to see from climate change, and then also identify assets in town, what their vulnerabilities are, and then the actions that they want to take to reduce those vulnerabilities in the long term. They prioritize those actions and hold a public listening session with the broader public to kind of vet that plan or summary of findings report, as we call it. And we do encourage regional partnerships through the planning grant. Actually, if you saw this previous slide, the communities that have hatch marks on them are ones that have done regional partnerships together. And we also definitely encourage regional partnerships for action grants as well. In fact, we score those a little bit more highly through our competitive criteria that we have for those. So this slide shows a little bit more of some of the kind of products that you could expect to see in the planning grant process. So on the left, it's a little bit small, but I think that's okay. You can get the general gist of it. That's sort of the matrix that the stakeholders fill out in the CRB workshop. So that's where they're identifying their assets, the different hazards and vulnerabilities, and then prioritizing actions that way. So it's a really, consistent process that helps us be able to tabulate data really across communities as well and provide great insights there, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then to the right, the top is just kind of a example of a piece of one of the summary of findings reports where they're showing what their top actions were, and they had voted on those as their top priority actions. And then the bottom corner there is just an example of a map that was made by one of our regional planning agencies who is a provider in Rentham's workshop, for example. And you can see that the stakeholders really use those maps through the CRB process. They can kind of identify places that have seen previous flooding or different assets they know about and see how they're interacting with climate hazards, and just helps move the conversation forward in that regard. So now I'm just going to talk about a little bit about the results. We've kind of analyzed the data from the 211 MVP planning reports we've gotten to date. And these are kind of the top themes or buckets for the hazards and vulnerabilities and actions. So it's a really, interesting insight into what our communities are prioritizing through when thinking about climate adaptation. So the top hazards you can see are inland flooding. That would obviously be higher if we were just talking about coastal flooding or coastal communities here. Coastal flooding would be a top hazard on this list, but we're talking about all of the 211 communities across the state here. So inland flooding was definitely the top hazard. In terms of vulnerabilities, people are concerned about stormwater management, transportation, infrastructure, and mobility. Natural resources, I think mostly just wanting more of them, and emergency management and preparedness. And then in terms of top actions, you can see they map pretty closely onto the vulnerabilities as well, including wanting more data and maps and information to kind of base decisions on, and changing regulations and zoning and policy. So I'm not going to get too far into this slide because it's got a lot of information on it, but these are the general things that we ask for with our planning grant application. So we want to see, commitment from the top municipal official, and also the names and qualifications of municipal leads, support from municipal and community partners, et cetera, et cetera. And another thing we ask for on the application is indication of whether there is a mapped environmental justice community, and how those representatives from those communities would be incorporated and heard during this planning process. And we have a special office on environmental justice that has an EJ map viewer for Massachusetts. So that is obviously helpful for communities figuring that out. And then Maya also mentioned a little bit about this as well, but we do allow communities to apply to update their hazard mitigation plan through MEMA and FEMA at the same time as doing an MVP planning process. A lot of times communities want to do these together because there's lots of overlap, as you can see from the middle circles here. It's a very similar process. The main difference is just that HMPs have historically not really incorporated climate lens onto identifying hazards and prioritizing actions. So we're just taking that kind of next step through the MVP program. And we've worked with MEMA to kind of put together a combined scope that addresses all of the requirements from both programs. So they can definitely do them together. And we've seen that be an approach that a lot of, especially communities that are less resourced, for example, want to do these together and become eligible for basically 2 pots of funding at the same time. And then I just wanted to talk a little bit about Amherst's planning process, because they're a good example of kind of an innovative but really great approach to the planning process. They actually hired a community liaison or someone from an underrepresented group in their community to do some special engagement throughout the planning process, and also increase access to meetings through interpretive and translation services, childcare, providing food, that type of thing that sort of dismantles some of the barriers to access in the community. They were able to get new people to the table, not just traditional stakeholders, and that was really helpful for building a plan that really represented the voices of the whole community. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more about action grants in particular. So for action grants, we have come up with basically our core values. They also kind of apply to the planning grant process as well, but definitely things we want to see in action grant proposals, especially because action grants are a lot more competitive. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. But essentially, we want projects to be community driven. We want them to utilize the best available climate data, and that they're proactive solutions. We want to be able to monitor project success and make sure that they're maintained into the future. We value employing nature-based solutions or leveraging nature to help us with our climate resilience goals. We also want to achieve broad and multiple community benefits, want to involve EJ or environmental justice communities, and have projects that really are benefiting those communities in particular. Regional solutions are important to us, and also kind of those innovative approaches and kind of transferable approaches that other communities and the state can really learn from. These are the 3 project types that we have for the action grant at the moment. A couple of rounds ago, we had 13, and we decided to kind of consolidate them into 3. We might kind of change these going forward. We're always kind of updating the program based on feedback that we're getting, which I think is super helpful to make it a little more nimble and responsive to what the state needs. Anyway, these are the 3 ones that we currently have. So planning and assessment type, regulatory type projects, those that employ nature-based solutions for ecological and public health. That could be like green infrastructure instead of gray infrastructure, or land acquisition, which is another project type that we have to conserve land for climate adaptation benefits, different projects like that. And then resilient redesigns and retrofits for critical facilities and infrastructure, which I think is pretty straightforward. So these are some of the application components for our action grant. We have a pretty extensive application template that also includes needing to fill out a public involvement and community engagement plan as part of the application, which is a new requirement from our last round. We have a scope and budget template to fill out. We require them to have submit a report basically on how far they've come since the planning process. It's a required yearly report. And then an attachment for design and construction projects, just so we have more information on permitting and where the project is at in terms of, where it's at in terms of the process from design to construction. A statement of match. We do require a 25% match for our action grant projects to ensure that the community is also kind of invested in the process and making our funds go a little further that way as well. And then letters of support from partners and the public are super important. So I mentioned we have competitive evaluation criteria here for the action grant process. It has become increasingly competitive over the past couple of years. This past round, which was sort of the spring and summer, we had over $46 million requested and over 142 applications from our MVP communities. So we were only able to fund around 10 million and around, I think, 40 projects to some degree. So we have an interagency review team that reviews all the projects, and we have pretty extensive evaluation criteria that are always available in our request for responses and in the application itself. But they very closely map onto those core principles that I talked about earlier. So I'm not going to go through all of them again. Here are some examples of MVP action projects. So this one is a regional project. I mentioned we do value those regional projects. But this group of communities wanted to study the rural dirt roads in their communities, lots of those in Western Massachusetts, and want to be able to come up with some best practices that they can share amongst other communities as well. Boston, I think a couple grant rounds ago, developed its first ever resilient building design guidelines to help make sure that the future development was prepared for at least 3 feet of sea level rise. And those two were sort of assessment, planning, regulatory type ones, and then moving into nature-based solutions. Northampton, which is in Western Massachusetts, restored a golf course by basically ripping it up, removing the drainage infrastructure, restoring the wetlands and planting more trees there to try and bolster natural mitigation features. And then in Mattapoisett, they purchased 120 acres of forest, streams, and freshwater wetlands to kind of preserve that area and prevent future development in that flood-prone area. Moving into one that's sort of nature-based and sort of resilient redesigns and retrofits, the city of Malden in the greater Boston area, they are sort of redesigning their Department of Public Works yard that's on public riverfront. And they had a really great engagement approach where they actually built a coalition of community leaders of color, youth, environmental advocates, and government stakeholders to really lead the process from start to finish. And this is really interesting because in their application, they were talking about how a lot of residents mentioned that they didn't even know that they had a river in town. So obviously there's some great benefits to opening up some more access to that. It's a really built up riverfront right now. Belchertown, this is an example of our resilient redesign and retrofit that we funded several phases of this project to date. But designing, they're basically designing, permitting, and constructing a replacement water storage tank to increase resiliency to drought, and also designing a rainwater harvest system at the high school that they could use to irrigate the athletic fields. And if you want to see any projects, either the ones I've talked about or others that we've funded, you can go to this webpage. The link is on the bottom of the page, and you can see summaries and deliverables from lots of the different projects that I talked about here. And that is it for me. That's my contact information.
Kara, that is amazing. That's a lot of content. I'm sure we'll have. I'm sure we'll have lots and lots of questions. Thank you so much. So let's turn it over to Laurie, Laurie Connors, who's the planner in Millbury, Massachusetts. So Laurie, if you want to turn your camera on and share your screen and your microphone, that would be terrific. And then from there, we'll open it up for discussion and conversation and questions. Laurie, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, thank you. I am just going to share my screen here. So just give me a moment. Can you see that?
Yes, I can.
Okay, very good. So my name is Laurie Connors, and I'm the Director of Planning and Development for the town of Millbury, Massachusetts. I am here to talk to you about the town of Millbury's experience with the MVP program. So I thought I'd start off by telling you just a little bit about the town of Millbury. Millbury is located in central Massachusetts. We abut the city of Worcester, which is the second largest city in the Commonwealth of Mass. We're a community of 15.84 square miles. We have a population of approximately 13,500 people and growing. We are a middle-income community. Our historic development as a mill community is largely owing to the Blackstone River, which bisects Millbury from east to west. And the mills that are dotted along the banks of the Blackstone River and its tributary streams are the reason why Millbury is included within the John H. Chafee Blackstone River Valley National Heritage Corridor. It's a mouthful. I always have to read it because I always forget a syllable there. But that is the birthplace of the American Industrial Revolution. So the Blackstone River is very, very important to the town of Millbury. We have been a complete streets community since 2018, which means that the town of Millbury adopted a complete streets policy. And we incorporate complete streets design principles in the massive reconstruction of any roadway project. and we've been an MVP community since 2019. So 2018 is the start of our MVP story. So during that period of time, we decided to partner with our neighboring communities of Grafton and Northbridge on a technical assistance grant for resiliency planning. We decided to partner with these communities because we're similar communities facing similar challenges, and this slide articulates our climate change challenges, which are shared by all three of our communities. And also, we have worked cooperatively with the towns of Northbridge and Grafton in the past on a variety of planning projects. So the state funded our grant application, and we started upon our way. So we hired the Central Massachusetts Regional Planning Commission as our consultant. Northbridge served as the lead community, which essentially meant that they handled the bulk of the paperwork and the money filtered through that community. So as far as our planning process was concerned, we formed a focus group which consisted of representatives from each community. We sat at the table together with the Central Mass Regional Planning Commission, and we developed a strategy for how we were going to move forward. So what we decided to do, I think we were the first regional group to do this together. We decided that we wanted to hold a regional resiliency planning workshop because we had a lot of regional stakeholders that overlapped. Like, for example, National Grid is our electricity provider, and they own a significant amount of land in our three communities. So we wanted a forum where they could come and share their thoughts. And the same was true with environmental groups like Mass Audubon is a significant entity within our region. And we also shared some state representatives and the state senator that we wanted to have his input. So in addition to the regional workshop, we had 3 separate individual workshops where we focused on the local issues. So in Millbury, we identified flooding, winter storms, wildfires, droughts, and extreme temperatures as being the most significant hazards facing the town of Millbury. We are already feeling the negative impacts of climate change, and in particular, riverine and stormwater flooding due to successive 100-year storms has been particularly challenging for our community in 2005, 2010, and 2018, when floods overtopped our roadways and damaged property. So thankfully, we went through our planning process. Our consultants, the Central Mass Regional Planning, articulated all of the results of our workshops into documents for each of our communities, and those were presented to the state, and we became certified as MVP communities in January of 2019. So that meant that we were then eligible to apply for our first action grant in 2019. So that was spring of 2019. So in the town of Millbury, a project that was deemed in our plan as being very significant was the Armory Village Revitalization Plan. So this plan dated back to 2016, when we were awarded a technical assistance grant from the US EPA, and that ended up resulting in a series of concept drawings which were aimed at revitalizing Millbury Center while simultaneously addressing flooding and non-point source pollution inputs to the Blackstone River. So if you look at this slide, the Blackstone River is located just south of this photograph. It is located approximately 500 linear feet from this intersection, which became the focus of our action plan. So on the heels of our first grant application, in May of 2018, we hired Weston and Sampson engineers to design the first phase of our project. So our downtown revitalization project was super large, super expensive, and it would have been super invasive to the businesses and the property owners in Millbury Center. So we decided to divvy it up into 3 different, more manageable phases. So phase 1 focused on the intersection of Elm and Main Streets, the Lower and Upper Commons, and portions of South Main Street, and Elm Street. We chose this area for a number of different reasons. This is the heart of our community. It's a blighted area with long-term commercial vacancies. It's an environmental justice area due to low income levels in Millbury Center. And it also needed a number of infrastructure upgrades. It needed accessibility, traffic signals, sewer, water, gas, drainage upgrades. And as I mentioned, it's very close and uphill of the Blackstone River. So the Blackstone River in the town of Millbury is a polluted body of water. It's classified as a Category 5 water due to up to 19 different causes of impairment, including trash, phosphorus, turbidity, etc. The list goes on and on and on. So the same month that we were awarding the design contract to Weston and Sampson, that's when we held our community resilience building workshop as part of the MVP planning process. And we also began updating our hazard mitigation plan, and we updated that complete streets policy, or adopted a complete streets policy for the first time. So the fact that we were planning for climate change and enhancing accessibility for all was really key to the ultimate design of the Armory Village revitalization project. So, for example, what we decided to do is expand the scope of the Phase 1 project over the way it was originally anticipated to include the Upper Common. And we did that is because it was a large green area where we could accommodate green infrastructure, including street trees and rain gardens. So this is a rendering of our Phase 1 plan. So our goal with the Armory Village plan was to address as many of the problems as we possibly could within the limits of the road right-of-way and town-owned property. So this strategy would enable us to access a whole host of grant programs and other sources of money to pay for this very, very expensive project. So Millbury, as I mentioned, is a middle-income community. We're not so dissimilar from communities throughout the country where there are so far too many wants and needs and not enough funds to go around. So right now, some of the challenges facing the town of Millbury is the need to construct a new elementary school, which is actually going out to bid. We also need a new fire station and a police station. So a pretty project like this was not high on the priority list for a lot of folks in the town of Millbury. So I had to find a more creative way of funding it. So the Phase 1 improvements are many. I'm going to move this out of the way. So we wanted to repave the intersection in portions of South Main, and Elm Streets. We wanted to reconstruct the Lower and Upper Commons and on-street parking lot on South Main Street. We wanted to upgrade the infrastructure, upgrade the traffic and pedestrian signals, installed decorative energy efficient streetlights, ADA compliant sidewalks, crosswalks, and ramps, bump outs to improve pedestrian safety, expand the sidewalks so that we could accommodate trees and outdoor seating. We wanted to install decorative pavers, benches, bike racks, and interpretive signage, and install street trees in attractive landscape areas. But the important thing is to think about how all of these improvements built on top of each other in order to create a sustainable whole. I lost my ability to forward.
It's not moving forward?
Oh, here we go.
Okay.
It's just sleepy, I suppose. So I thought that because this is such a complicated project, that I would just zoom in on one aspect of the project and kind of focused on the climate change aspects of it. So I wanted to focus on the Lower Common. So these are some of the green infrastructure features that exist within this area. So under this design, rain and snow melt flow into an integrated system of vegetated bump outs, rain gardens, bioswales, a flow-through planter, and a subsurface infiltration facility where it is soaked up, stored, and filtered. Porous pavers that are located within the pedestrian plazas, which I'm identifying here, they're shown in brown, as well as alongside the concrete walkways, absorb, filter, and direct the stormwater flow from sidewalks to these features by way of perforated pipes. So underneath this, this ribbon that's adjacent to the concrete sidewalks are perforated pipes. So together, these features limit the amount of pollutants entering the Blackstone River, which ultimately makes for a healthier ecosystem. And they also act like a sponge, which is important to mitigate the flooding of the Blackstone River that we've been experiencing as of late. So it captures the whole and holds the stormwater while slowly infiltrating it into the ground over time. So the street trees planted throughout the downtown also provide shade, which helps with the cooling, and it also provides habitat to animals. So this is a lovely before picture of the Lower Common. So this is before we started construction. And you can see that it wasn't a very attractive or welcoming space. And this is the way it looked last week. So the construction is well underway and wrapping up. I do anticipate that the bulk of construction will be completed this week, actually. And then we'll just be wrapping up punch list items after that. So I wanted to include some pictures of the green infrastructure features that have been installed. So these are two of the rain gardens that are within the vicinity of the Lower Common. So for those of you who don't know, a rain garden is a slightly depressed landscaped area that's designed to filter and infiltrate runoff. It includes low-level plantings that don't impact site distance, so that's really important. And they're also very low maintenance. So here's a picture of a flow-through planter, which is filled with gravel and planting soil. So in addition to being attractive, it collects the runoff from the roof through the gutter system. It temporarily stores it and drains the excess water via a perforated underdrain. And here's an image of the vegetated bump outs. We have several of these throughout the downtown. And this is definitely by far the most controversial part of my downtown revitalization project. So a bump out is a traffic calming measure which extends the width of the sidewalk and the curb line. We have put these bump outs wherever there is a crosswalk. And the reason why we married these two aspects together is because the nature of the bump out causes the drivers to slow down. So pedestrians are easier to see when they're in the crosswalk, and they also have a shorter distance to travel when crossing the street. And then we vegetated them. We thought that they were fantastic opportunities to install street trees in our very, very urbanized downtown where there was otherwise no space for street trees. And we also have other complementary vegetation, and combined, these really do a great job of absorbing that snow melt and the rainwater. So there are many, many benefits of this project. Of course, for you folks, the most important benefits, I'm sure, are the climate change benefits. So I already talked about how the trees reduce the heat island impacts. They absorb the environmental pollutants, which ultimately result in a cleaner Blackstone River, and they help us deal with flooding. But what was also important to our community is the economic development benefits. By making the downtown more attractive, we are hoping to attract more business to our open storefronts and possibly some additional residents. And we want to encourage our property owners to invest in and fix up their properties. So as I mentioned, this isn't a cheap project. The budget as of this date, it may change tomorrow, is $2,172,000, and that includes, this number is actually slightly higher, about $95,000 in change orders. So the funding sources, this is the original breakdown of funding before we had all the overages. And as you can see, we are taking advantage of a variety of funding sources in order to fund a project that most likely wouldn't have gotten off the ground otherwise. And our multi-pronged approach of resolving many issues simultaneously is the reason why we were able to attract so many funders. So we're very grateful for our funders, especially the MVP Action Grant Program, who put $1 million towards this grant. So the reason why I put this slide in is if New Jersey is thinking about doing a similar program, I just really wanted you to be cognizant of the challenges of people like me who are trying to get large projects off the ground. And the most difficult thing for me was coordinating all of these various funders and their deadlines for grants and their construction deadlines. And it really, really was difficult. And one thing that I noticed that several of the funders did is that they didn't do a great job of taking into account the winter season. So many of the construction grants are awarded in late summer with construction deadlines of June 30th of the following year. So these deadlines are exceedingly difficult to meet because of the procurement requirements in Massachusetts, and coupled with a short construction season owing to the cold, snowy winters and the rainy spring. So unfortunately, when you threw COVID-19 on top of this, we were not able to meet our funding deadline. So thankfully, the MVP program was able to give us an extension, which we are very grateful for. And as I mentioned, we are wrapping up construction as we speak. So that brings me to the next step, which is our phase 2 project. And we just recently learned about a month ago that we received a grant in the amount of $125,600 to start designing the phase 2 project, which you can see the phase 1 project is kind of blurred out a little bit. And then we have the phase 2 project next to it. So what we're hoping to do is tackle the municipal parking lot, which right now is definitely a mess. And we want to make it a more, not only a more attractive and a better functioning parking lot, but also one that incorporates bioswales and rain gardens and is a much more climate friendly space than what we currently have today. So we are very grateful to the MVP program for funding us once again, and stay tuned, because in another couple of years, we will have another exciting project to talk about. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to answer any questions that folks might have.
Laurie, thank you so much for that inspiring overview of the work in Millbury. Both my daughters live in Boston, so I can drive from New Jersey to Boston with my eyes closed, but on my next drive north, I'll definitely swing through Millbury.
You'll have to give me a call and I'll give you a tour.
I will. So let me invite, well, Kara's on, and Maya, if you want to join us as well on camera, and Marjorie, do you want to join us on camera? So what we're going to do is, I have a million questions, but I'm going to be a good host and turn it over to Marjorie, who has been going through the chat box, and I think also adding some additional questions from the Climate Change Resource Center directors and she and I about some things in terms of how some elements of your programs could align with New Jersey sort of culture and authorities and things like that. So Marjorie, I'm going to turn it over to you and to see if
Can you hear me?
I can.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Well, I'm exhausted listening to this presentation. You guys are unbelievable, and very active chat box. So we only have, it's too bad we only have until 1, so let's get going.
Yeah.
There's a lot of questions. So, Maya, sorry, you showed climate resilience standards. Can you talk a little bit at the beginning? Can you talk a little bit about the process regarding how you develop them or are developing them?
Yes, are developing them. Still very much in the works. So we hired a consultant team to facilitate the process, and includes Weston and Sampson, AECOM, Woods Hole Group. I believe that's it. And we are structuring our engagement through the RMAT, the Resilient Massachusetts Action Team. That's how we sort of engage agencies on the topic. So we had agency working groups focused on the different asset types that we were looking at. That was buildings, natural resources, and infrastructure. An agency working group focused on capital planning, and then a scientific advisory group. And so through that engagement structure and the consultant team, they were really looking at sort of practices that existed from other states, federally. The National Transportation Research Board, I think, provided some methodologies, but really compiling sort of what existed out there, what were best practices in the engineering and design space right now, for utilizing climate change data when we have best available data. So in Massachusetts, we are developing a statewide coastal flood risk model that really uses the latest climate science and models, thousands of different storms along the coastline to project future sea level rise extents and probabilities across the coast. So that's our best available coastal data, and out of that there's recommendations for sort of which planning horizons or return periods to use for different types of projects. But in the precipitation and temperature space, we don't have that level of advanced statewide downscaled modeling, and so it's more about how do we develop proxy methodologies until we have that level of analysis and modeling done for utilizing the data that we do have. And so it's different approaches around going into the NOAA data and adding different sort of percentage buffers to account for future climate change based on historic events and global climate models. And so we're just trying to put these methodologies out there as sort of in an interim basis until processes are complete within the state to develop statewide precipitation and temperature projections that are underway. And we've also been working with a stakeholder technical advisory group to vet, a lot of these approaches and put them out for public comment. The drafts are actually still on our website. I could put the link for our public comment period that was over the summer. And we're really just trying to pull this all together into sort of an easy to use web tool and pilot it next year and see how we can improve it from there. But I'll put that link in the chat.
Thanks. Thank you. Thanks, Mike.
So I'm kind of just going along in categories here. So on the capital planning projects that you mentioned, are those assessed for state projects only, or are these for municipal projects? Just a clarification.
Sure. So initially the tool is being meant for state projects and state projects that are funded by state capital funds. So that's largely state projects, but it's also state grant programs like MVP that are using capital funds to invest in infrastructure and assets. So we are working to pilot it through MVP next year. It's going to be, more in the direction of an optional process, and sort of we can get more data and see how it's working. But basically the intention in our first version is to focus on the state, pilot it, and then expand from there. But it will be publicly available online as a resource.
Got it. We had a lot of questions about the interconnectedness of these programs. So can you talk a little bit more about how the local MVP plan and the planning grants connect to the local HMP, and whether there are program functions that overlap, for instance, with FEMA CRS program?
Yeah, I can start on that. So yeah, I mentioned a little bit in my presentation about how we do allow that connection between the MVP planning process and the hazard mitigation planning process. I think I saw somebody in the chat asking whether that was incentivized in some way. We do offer a little bit of extra funding on top of our normal MVP funding for that process if they want to do that combined plan. But I think a lot of people see the benefit in doing them both together anyway. So I think there's already kind of that built-in incentive. And yeah, in terms of collaborating with other types of programs and funding sources, that's something that we're always trying to figure out how to do better and build out. So yeah, we're constantly seeking those connections between other programs.
So someone asked whether or not you've seen Stafford funds are being used to fund projects that would not have previously been funded under the conventional HMP using this process.
I'm not familiar with Stafford funds. Maya, do you know?
Not really. I think we work with our colleagues at MEMA on sort of how we can better integrate the processes and work with communities that got FEMA funding and are on sort of our right timeline, our scope into their work so they can accomplish, both processes at once. But we could share the connection with sort of the hazard mitigation contact at MEMA. They would sort of know best about that world.
Great, thanks. Does this integrated state plan relate to the state's MEPA, the Mass Environmental Policy Act?
So MEPA is in our office, and so we work closely with that team. I guess the plan isn't directly related to MEPA. That MEPA, we're working to update, their sort of their guidance in alignment with sort of as new climate science gets developed for the state, as these standards and tools and resources get developed. And so we're working to, to better coordinate with them, but because they're focused on permitting of private assets and projects as well as public projects, we haven't, we're not, fully in line yet, as we're initially focused on state assets and projects in this initial point.
Great. Kara talked a lot about connections to EJ communities. Is a portion of the dollar set aside specifically for grants in EJ communities?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and something that we are actually actively considering for our next round. I mentioned we do a lot of review based on feedback each round and incorporate different improvements into the process. So it's very much ongoing and working process. But the way that we currently have done it in the past is prioritizing that through the evaluation criteria of the action grants. So that might be what we can continue to do in the future, or possibly setting aside specific amounts of dollars. But we do see that through our criteria and just prioritizing it through that, that's a way to really be able to fund a lot of those projects and make sure that they're also meeting a lot of our other criteria through the program.
There were questions about the municipal reception and participation to the program, and I think some clarification is asked about whether or not municipalities in Massachusetts are required to do this and required to implement municipal vulnerability plans, or is it just an incentivization program?
Yeah, it's actually totally voluntary, so it's not required at all. So yeah, that's one reason we're very proud of our high participation number at that 89% number. And yeah, I think it has just spread really rapidly because it's a program that a lot of communities have seen value in. We do kind of offer some of those incentives, like combining with the hazard mitigation plan, like the regional planning and working together on things. But I think it started with some sort of low-hanging fruit communities that were already like having these conversations and wanting to dive further. And then other communities saw those, and it just kind of spread from there. And our regional coordinators that I mentioned, we have 6 of them throughout the state that have been hired on in the past year. This is one of the areas that they're actively working on, especially the ones out west where we have lower participation than in sort of the east or greater Boston area. And those like one-on-one connections with those communities and helping build capacity there and showing them sort of the value of the program, I think has been super helpful.
Another question we got was whether or not there are environmental regulations that are factored into the program, the MVP, such as no build areas or building codes or contaminated sites and the like.
So MVP is sort of an entirely community-driven process at this point. So it's sort of based on their priorities with some guidance from us. I'm not sure exactly what is being meant by whether the regulations are involved there, but definitely the projects need to adhere to any other regulations that are going on throughout the state. I think that has been something that's been happening throughout all the projects.
Someone asked whether or not there are incentives for plans that also reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah, that's also a great question. So we have another program that actually the MVP program was sort of based off of, that's called the Green Communities Program. And that's really sort of the mitigation side of the house. So we're constantly seeking ways to kind of collaborate between our 2 programs, especially in the area of, for example, energy resilience, that really does overlap the 2 quite closely, obviously. So yeah, we see a lot of our communities. I think I have a slide, but it wasn't in this deck, that show the overlap between which communities are actually green communities that are meeting those mitigation standards, and which are also participating in the MVP program. But there's a lot of overlap, and communities are actively kind of working on both in tandem.
Yeah, and we definitely fund a lot of climate action plans that are both conducting greenhouse gas emissions inventories and planning, and then connecting that with their adaptation planning, and also the intersection of energy resilience and nature-based solutions is sort of a big overlap between the 2 that we really promote through the program.
So someone asked about whether or not the interagency council that Maya discussed identifies funding or other incentives from other state agencies to encourage implementation of the MVP planning grant plans. Yeah, great question. That's definitely an area that we're super focused on.
growing into. In this last year, we were able to identify some funding through the capital budget to go towards implementing projects that were sort of ready to go and ready to be completed within the fiscal year. And so we were able to do sort of a small number of those, but that's definitely an area that we'd like to move into, and that's sort of essential for our continued growth and progress, is, you know, to identify additional funding streams and programs to get a lot of these projects off the ground.
So I'm going to switch now to the implementation grants. You guys are great. Rapid fire. Do you feel you're seeing communities proposing implementation projects they might not have otherwise considered without this program?
Yeah, I think so.
That might be one for Laurie also.
Yeah, that's a great question for Laurie to answer. Actually, I'll let you go first, Laurie.
Yes, absolutely. Like I had mentioned, this is a $2.1 million project, which actually started out as a small lower common revitalization project and morphed from there. And the reason why it morphed is because of the funding that became available. So when we started, the MVP action grants didn't actually exist. So at that point, MVP was just a planning program. So there weren't actually any action grants, although we were promised that they were coming. So we were trying to position ourselves to attract the MVP program with our project. So if it wasn't for the MVP program and the large amount of money that they were willing to give communities, our project would probably have been about a sixth of the size that it currently is. So yeah, I mean, this is a fabulous program, and you know, the phase 2 project is really also reliant on our ability to get grant funds.
Great. I'm still going back and forth between the questions. We're still getting a lot of questions. So for Laurie, another question. Someone asked regarding your downtown project, did you seek federal funding via programs like through the Federal Highway Administration, State DOT? I'm not sure if you mentioned that, and I apologize if you did already.
The MassWorks program is probably what you're referencing. In Massachusetts, it's called MassWorks. And one of the negatives for our project is they usually want a private partner to come to the table. So they want to see a development proposed, and I didn't have that. So I was not eligible to apply for that big pot of money. And that would have been lovely because, of course, I could have just gone to the MassWorks program and did everything that I needed to do with one grant. So that wasn't eligible for me. So I did go to federal funding through the EPA. Actually, I received 2 different grants that filtered through originally from the EPA. One came through the Department of Environmental Protection, and the other one came through the Narragansett Bay Estuary Program, which is with the Blackstone Rivers, because we have the Blackstone River through the town of Millbury. So we did, and we did also get Complete Streets funding. So that is federal money that came through Mass DOT, kind of, of course, I'm sure that all the grants are called different things in New Jersey. But it's very similar to what we have in Massachusetts. It's called the Chapter 90 program, which funds road reconstruction projects. So this is a parallel program which funds essentially sidewalks, bump outs, crosswalks, traffic lights, and the like.
Great. I'm going to jump to some other questions here. One really interesting question: does the state training of planners result in some sort of certificate for the planners?
So I'm assuming they're talking about the MVP planning grant training. So it's not like a formal certificate, but they get put on our list of vendors that communities can use to hire for helping them through the process. So yeah, we do have a list of everybody who has come to the training and done the program, and that's what people can use to select their vendor from. Currently, there's a lot of interest. We have over 400 people certified through that list. So definitely, yeah, a lot of interest from the consultants in Massachusetts.
And I think that's an area that we're looking to sort of shift a little focus onto the municipality staff themselves and develop some training for municipalities on climate change data and these resources that are being developed and best practices and things like that to start to build more sort of expertise in-house in municipalities.
So we had some questions about your interaction with the legislature. And to what extent you might interact with the legislature and whether or not there's a requirement for state agencies to evaluate the MVP program for the legislature.
Not at this point in terms of the evaluation. I mean, we sort of just on a basic level track participation and funding, and we're looking at more detailed program metrics, but all of that has been sort of self-initiated out of sort of our own interest to better evaluate the program and see how we're moving forward. In terms of the legislature, there's not sort of requirements at this point. On the mitigation side, that's sort of more coming out of the legislature and requirements to deliver some of these 2030, 2050 plans by certain deadlines. We've been working over the last several years on legislation to identify new revenue and funding sources for climate and adaptation. That is still sort of in discussion and underway, and will be sort of a longer term conversation. But that's sort of where we are right now. I think we're still sort of in the first few years of all of this, honestly, and so there's a lot more to go, a lot more to grow. And I think definitely around the sort of the 5-year anniversary of this work in the coming years, we hope to see that as a milestone to really put forward some new frameworks and resources and hopefully program metrics and really sort of identify how to keep the momentum growing and how to really sort of support municipalities in doing this work even more.
So I think there are still some other questions about metrics. So I'm just going to ask again about whether or not, people are still asking, do you track total investments? Do you calculate benefits generated for communities? Are there any metrics that are particularly key for what you're doing?
Yeah, I can try and take this one and then move on to Maya. So yes, that's a really great question, and one that we're kind of actively tackling and thinking about, as Maya said. Because our adaptation projects span so many different categories and things, it's hard to figure out what exact metrics kind of could align across all of those, but definitely thinking more about, in terms of obviously investment, we do track that, how much funding we're giving out in different areas, in different regions and things like that. But also, what's the number of people protected into the future? What's the cost avoided? Those are all great questions that we would love to have answers to through the program, and definitely trying to figure out if there's ways that we can do that in-house, how to have some more of those types of metrics to be able to report out. But I guess stay tuned on that one, something that we're trying to figure out currently.
Did anyone else want to add to that? I just thought I heard that you were going to. So, okay, I'll move along. So I think this question's for Kara. You mentioned you allow towns to do MVP planning and HMP together. How are you incentivizing that? And also, is there a formal way in which the MVP plans are linked to, I think this is the state Climate Adaptation Plan. I think that's what the SHMCAP is. Yeah,
the SHMCAP. So I think, in terms of the MVP, HMP, and incentives, I think I mentioned this before, but we do offer a little bit of boost of funding to do both of them. So that's a little bit of an incentive. And then just generally, I think it's easier for communities if they're thinking about doing both of those and want to be eligible for both pots of funding. It just makes sense to do them together. So I don't think it's not that hard of a sell, I guess. And we actually also, our MVP funding can be used as the match for HMP funding through FEMA. So there's just some nice kind of, similarities and ways to get that done kind of together. And then in terms of the integration between MVP and SHMCAP, so MVP is really kind of the way we're fostering local partnerships and building adaptation locally, whereas the SHMCAP was more focused on state, at least originally. But definitely thinking about that, especially as we're moving to kind of update the SHMCAP. And Maya, I don't know if you wanted to talk a little about the risk assessment that's coming up.
Yeah, so it was always sort of the initial intention that MVP and local planning results and planning priorities sort of roll up into helping to direct the state plan as a whole. And so initially we're starting to evaluate sort of the, over 200 local plans that we've received to date in terms of identifying some of the things that Tara pointed out, but other criteria around sort of hazards and vulnerabilities and actions that municipalities are identifying and prioritizing. We are in some initial stages of scoping out a statewide climate risk assessment that would really look a little beyond what our 2018 plan did, which was more focused on state government itself, towards different sectors and regions across the state, and utilizing a lot of the data that we've received to date through MVP plans, but also looking a bit more broadly and helping to direct different priorities and focus areas in different regions potentially. But that's again sort of an early step that we're scoping out to better connect the local planning that's going on with the state planning.
So Marjorie, I think we probably have one more question.
One last question, and I'm going to leave this is a big enchilada, I'll call it, question, which talks about where you're talking about priorities. So for New Jersey, this is a big question, I'm sure, for Massachusetts. Have you or how are you addressing perhaps the concept of transitioning away from high-risk areas, such as retreat, into your prioritization and guidance?
Yeah, that's a big one. I would say we probably don't have, anything too official to say in that space other than that. I think that, the standards and the design standards that we're recommending really are assessing and flagging projects that are in very high risk, high vulnerable locations and flagging that for capital planning managers who would not normally have sort of an eye towards climate risk and resiliency. So now they have that decision support to know that those projects, where they are, and where they're being funded and why, and be able to ask more questions around why that investment is being made and what other purposes it's serving, and asking if other sites have been identified or have been alternatives have been assessed and things like that. So I think our climate design standards tool, it's really a risk screening tool to flag some of these high exposure projects and provide have resiliency be more of an evaluation criteria and factor in thinking in a way that it really hasn't before in a data-driven way. And I think through the MVP program, we're funding projects that are conducting, alternatives analyses for investments, that are looking at cost benefit analyses for providing services and resources and investments in different areas. So we're seeing that come up from municipalities as well, to start to sort of explore that space and what that means. And I think it's just an area that, we'll be continuing to identify sort of best practices and how to move forward. But for right now, I would say the climate risk screening tool is our next step to really start to better incorporate resiliency into some of these capital budgeting and planning decisions.
Okay, Marjorie, thanks for all that curating. There were a lot of questions today. So on behalf of everybody here at the Climate Change Resource Center, we would like to offer our most sincere thanks to Mia Mansfield, Kara Runsten, and Laurie Connors for an incredible conversation. Lots and lots of ideas for us here in New Jersey. To everyone who joined us, please take the time to visit the website of the Climate Change Resource Center, which I'll ask Marjorie to type into the chat box once again. You can sign up to receive our emails. The Resource Center was established by a law that was passed this past January and signed by Governor Murphy. It has a mission to collaborate with other academic institutions to undertake outreach, analysis, and research to support efforts throughout New Jersey in various sectors, government, public sector, private, communities, to adapt to and mitigate a changing climate. So we hope that you will look at the website and get to know us a little bit better. Also, we hope that you'll join us for our next Climate Academy webinar on Tuesday, November 10th at noon, which will be the third in a series on climate change and the preservation of cultural and historic resources. Kate Markopol, who is the administrator of New Jersey's State Historic Preservation Office, will be joined by Dominique Hawkins of Preservation Design Partnership in a session that'll be about protecting historic residences from flooding with a focus on building elevations, the regulatory basis for historic preservation, and climate adaptation and design challenges. Again, this is the third in a series, but you do not need to participate in the others to understand some of these topics. But if you'd like to, you can view the recordings of the earlier sessions on the Climate Change Resource Center website, along with the recordings of all of our sessions. So this concludes today's event. Thank you again to our friends in Massachusetts, and thanks to everyone who was able to join us. And thanks to Matt and Marjorie. Thanks, everybody. Stay safe and healthy.